Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of Westport Writes, the illustrating edition. Tonight, we have three artists who illustrate books. Their styles are very different, and I'm sure their backgrounds are as well, which will provide a variety of views of the industry for you all. Tonight, we have Kerstin Rau as our moderator. She recently started not one, but two businesses after teaching in the Westport schools. Our artists this evening on the screen, we have Sarah Becan, Rowan, McCall, and Gregg Schiegle. I met Sarah late last year with a cookbook. When a cookbook she illustrated came out, Let's Make Dumplings. And that made my mouth water in spite of the lack of photos. Rowan grew up in Westport and is taking the publishing world by storm with her horror-styled drawings. And Gregg has a multitude of children's graphic novels already out in the world, and more to come. So now, I'll let these three tell you more about their work and their journey in their careers. So please, Kerstin, take us away.
Yay, thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to the Westport Library for having us all here. This is such a special thrill to host this panel. And if you, the audience, are anything like me, you are a super fan of art and illustration, and you just want to know what makes these people tick, what inspires them, how they do what they do. So let's get into the magic. My first question, and let's go in alphabetical order of last names. So Sarah will be first, Rowan second, Gregg third. Is that okay, everybody? Okay, cool. That way we always know the order. So my question for you, and I made it cute because it's illustration, is like, what is your illustrator origin story? So Sarah, what's your story?
I guess I was always drawing, like, starting as a child, going all the way through school. I think I had a little 4-panel comic published in Cricket magazine when I was 9 years old. I got in trouble in 6th grade because we had to keep these very detailed science notes in our science class, and my margins were full of drawings of unicorns. And so from that point on, I had to keep 2 separate notebooks. One was for the unicorns and one was for the science notes. I drew cartoons all through high school, and when I got to college, decided to go ahead and major in art. I went to a liberal arts school with an arts major and really wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. Ended up doing graphic design to pay the bills, but I was still always drawing mini comics, and started a web comic that I called I Think You're Sawsome, that was all about food and cooking and recipes and restaurants that I was going to. And some of the restaurants that I drew comics about in this webcomic reached out to me and asked if I would want to do commercial illustration for them. And one of the ones that I started working with got a cookbook deal and asked me to illustrate some of the recipes in the book that they were publishing for their restaurant. And that's kind of how I got launched into doing illustrated cookbooks and comic book cookbooks, basically.
What a marvelous superhero story. Thank you. Rowan, same question for you, your origin story.
When I was in grad school, I had the thought of, I like drawing, and I also like writing. But I can't do both, can I? You can't be an illustrator and a writer. Until I decided to go, you know what I could do? I could become a comic artist. That's the most efficient way out of this. That's the most efficient way to tell a story, is to write comics. And I guess I just never stopped.
I think that's marvelous.
Yep. So I went to, yes, I was, as you mentioned before, I was born and raised in Westport, Connecticut. I went to Staples, then I graduated and I went to RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, to go to illustration. And I left RISD and decided I was not going to do comics. I was going to do illustrations until I got a comic job. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing comics. A lot of those kind of things. Yeah, that's about it. That's the
I
origin
love
story.
it.
There you go.
There will be follow-up questions.
There will be,
Your
I
art-
figure like
your-
there's probably gonna be more questions. So that's all you need for now.
Definitely. All right, let's turn to Gregg and hear your superhero illustration origin story.
So as a kid, speaking of superheroes, I became very enamored of superheroes early on, probably as early as 2 years old. And then that led to comics, and I was drawing since forever, as far as I can remember. And at some point, I became aware that drawing comics was a job, probably 3rd or 4th grade. And I remember making the decision in about 4th, maybe 5th grade, looking at animation, comic strips, and comic books, and deciding comic books was the direction I wanted to go. If you had asked me as an adult to take advice from a 4th grader, probably not the best idea, but that's the advice I took. And I sort of committed myself to making comics from that day forward, and was drawing throughout high school. Ended up going to art school in New York for all of a month. Did not like art school. And I left art school, went to a plain old regular college, and have a degree in advertising that still is in a tube. I've never used it. Because the summer before my senior year of college, I got an internship at Marvel Comics. I worked there that summer in the editorial department and met a lot of people. And then at that point, this was sort of, the internet was still pretty new. So I did samples. I drew 5 sample pages, and I'd make photocopies and send those in the mail. And that led to my first freelance job. After doing that it wasn't the first time. I sent out several packets, and then got my first freelance job, and then a staff job opened up. So I worked editorial for a number of years. And while I was working editorial, I was also trying to pick up freelance work. And then that just continued to lead down different paths, where I went from comics to licensing, illustration, to licensed book publishing. And it's continued to sort of bop along to whatever sort of comes around. So more recently, I've started doing little job character design work in animation. And throughout all of that, I've been making comics or self-publishing or creating things in that format. The comics format, as I think the 3 of us can agree, is really, there's an alchemy to it that's unlike anything else.
That is, I mean, could that be a more spot on origin story for an illustrator? All 3 of you are just so fascinating and intriguing. This is really great. I want to get into your individual styles. So I want to start with Sarah. Tonight, my husband's making ramen for dinner. And looking at your illustrated cookbook, Let's Make Ramen, holy moly, like delicious. So I noticed in the beginning, this is going to get pretty philosophical. You mentioned these Japanese principles, and I wanted to know how they apply to your work. So you're on the spot a little. One is shokunin, singular focus on craft, kaizen, sustained focus on improvement, and kodawari, passionate focus on perfecting one's art. Do any of these resonate with you? Or just backing up and getting into sort of like a whole Japanese influence? I kind of wanted to dig into that and hear your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I obviously can't take credit for those concepts because they are ancient Japanese concepts. And it was my co-author on that book, Hugh Amano, who wanted to bring those in specifically in how they apply to cooking. But absolutely, I think they definitely apply to, I mean, not just illustration, but comics specifically, because, if you're a painter and you're making a painting, you just have to get that one painting right. But if you're drawing a comic book, if you're drawing a graphic novel, you have to be drawing your characters and your settings consistently from panel to panel to panel. So you're drawing them hundreds of times over the course of a storyline with like subtle gradations in time of day and attitude and emotion and expressiveness. So yes, you are really drilling down and drawing the same thing over and over and over again until you get it right. So it absolutely is a way to hone your skill. It can feel tedious at times, for sure, and very time consuming, but but I mean, you know, like we were saying earlier, I really do think that comics in particular are just the best of both worlds. You get to combine the best of verbal communication with the best of, you know, imagery, and put them together, you know, to really drive home, you know, a message in a way that other art forms aren't really capable of.
Man, you are well prepared for that answer. That's wonderful.
I
Thank
think about
you.
this stuff a lot.
I think that's great. Well, you're very welcome among fellow fans and enthusiasts and practitioners in this audience and in this panel. All right. So Rowan, when I looked at your work online, I wanted to look at it more and more. Like I want to
good.
see, yeah, good answer.
Good.
Yes, please look more at my stuff. I wrote down elegant, macabre images. And I got this feeling that the characters were both yearning for and yet defying connection. There's a sort of tension where like that's just a feeling that came through to me. And that my question for you with this Gothic elegance, what are your influences? Like what artists or movements or things influence and infuse into your work?
Oh, well, I feel like my brain automatically goes to things like European comics. There's a lot of European comics. I feel like if you see my artwork and see them, they're like you can kind of really see it. Stuff like Tintin and that kind of era of comics, especially like how I write is very much more of these kind of like I think actually a lot of influence in Tintin that and like terms of structure. But there is this kind of, the name escapes me, which is great for a thing like this, but there is this concept of kind of filling in a page with detail and elegant and clean line work. That comes up in French comics especially a lot, that I really like. At the very least, I really like drawing that detail because storytelling is a really big component of illustration for me. I really like telling stories, obviously. And I especially like my own personal projects usually tend to be making an illustration with the idea of like, this is telling some sort of story, like there's an illustration for a story that actually exists, but only on my head, but it's fun. It's really fun. But also like what you were kind of saying before, is sort of about like sort of the feeling of it, which the sort of like the vibes, especially the characters. There's this concept in tour theory is of like the painter can't help but paint themselves. And so I guess there is that sort of feeling of my own emotional state and my own anxieties, because I am a very, you've known me since I was a kid. I'm a very anxious kid. I'm still an anxious adult, better now. But that kind of feeling of never going away, of desperately wanting a connection, but not knowing what to do with it and how to kind of cross that bridge. And so I guess that is something I explore in my art, whether I like it or not.
I personally totally identify with that feeling myself. I've just learned how to present a certain front to the world, but behind the scenes, there's like, oh no. So, and I think there's something about that also invites in the vulnerabilities of your reader and your viewer. And you have such a beautiful hand, like the way you draw. It's like reassuring to your reader to see such incredible technical competence and composition. So just kudos to you. It's been really wonderful to watch you blossom. So yeah, so Gregg, I guess you didn't grow up with me around, so slight disadvantage. But I read your Pix books. I read these two.
Thank you.
And what a fascinating superhero. Like there's all these sort of typical insecurities that a growing up young adult goes through. and you throw in not just superpowers, but some weird incidents that happen, like she shrinks down tiny at one point. And so I was delightfully surprised as I read through it, because I thought, all right, then, I should be able to figure out the plot. I was like, I have no idea what's going to happen next, which is a compliment. Like, that's a real pleasure. So as I read through your stuff, two questions came up for me. One was, do you conceptualize from a visual point of view, from a story point of view? Do you think of it like a movie? Do you think of it like scene to scene like a movie? So that was my first question, is like, how do you conceive of the story and how it moves? And my second one is, what is it like for you to write from a girl character's perspective? Like, what helps you get into the mindset and that kind of thing? So those are my two questions for you.
Okay. So the first question is the process of it. It all kind of happens at once. It's a little hard to specifically explain, but there are some scenes I see and I could picture what's happening. And then there are some sequences where I know there's a thing I want to happen, but I don't know how it's going to look when it's until I start laying the thing out. With those books, the initial outline is just sort of handwritten breakdown of, in chapter 1, these 5 things happen. Chapter 2, these 6 things happen. This is how the chapter ends. And then when I start writing, it's writing with the pictures to start. So it's a bunch of thumbnails, and I just start blocking in what happens on those pages, wanting to make sure. So to something Sarah was saying in terms of, on a page, there's multiple panels, multiple drawings of the same characters over and over, but also within that, there's the composition, and you want to tell the story visually as much as you can. And in doing that, you're positioning characters in certain ways, you're leading the eye in certain ways, you're making sure your word balloons are in certain places, and then you want your tensions to come and go in terms of, when you turn a page, a surprise is on the next page, especially if it's a left side facing page. It becomes a very elaborate puzzle in a certain way. The more pages you're working with, and you want to make sure everything fits and plays out the way you want the reader to experience it. So when a surprise comes, you want the reader to be surprised. So you need to set all that up and put all your elements in the panel so that when something appears, it doesn't come out of nowhere and the reader doesn't get lost. So in the process of writing, I start visually, and under my little thumbnails, I jot down notes in terms of what's actually happening on that page, so that when I go back and I start adding the script or the dialogue, I can remember what the scribbles mean. And then it starts to build from there. It's kind of like the way a sculptor would start with a armature and start adding clay and keeps adding to it. Or, to use a cooking metaphor, you start with like a bare recipe, and then you start mixing ingredients, and you start putting your stuff together. You start doing the food prep, cutting things up, making sure everything's the right size. And then the cooking happens, and that's sort of like the layout and the drawing and the inking and the color, like all that stuff is like the cookery, and the, if you're making a cake, the cake decorating, like that's all the stuff that's above the iceberg. Like that's the stuff you see. And then there's all this stuff below that takes way more time and way more mental energy to create, so that the story seems hopefully effortless, but there's so much that's happening underneath before anybody even sees what they're reading. Did that answer the question?
I loved it.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like I was thinking about your work as you were talking, and I was trying to imagine, like, what would those thumbnails look like, and which 2-page splash was he, conceiving of and he's pleased with.
The sequence where she's tiny and she's fighting that giant magic 8-ball with tentacles and a scorpion tail, like that. And if that doesn't make you want to read this book, what will? That was an image I had, like a tiny girl with a Q-tip fighting this 8-ball in like the bathroom sink sewer thing. Like that was just, it was a strange idea that occurred to me, and I'd drawn that image, and I knew what that was, and then I just had to build everything around it to get to that point. So some of the spreads I kind of knew, and what's interesting with that book is it originally started as mini comics, and that spread. So in the book that you see, it's a single page. In the original mini comic, it was a double page spread. So they actually got redrawn a couple of different times. But yeah, some of the stuff I see very clearly, and some of the stuff I find as I'm working through it. Sort of happens in the moment on the page, or in the thumbnails
That's
rather.
super cool. And then just a super quick follow-up.
Yeah. So
This
writing
is a girl protagonist. So what helped you get into the mindset?
Well, so first was writing a character as a character. So just, characters have things they want or need or are trying to sort of struggle to get through. So with Pix, her bit is she is very sure that she is a fairy princess, that her father was the king of the fairies, but he's not in the story. We don't meet him. So people think, they see that she has powers. They recognize, okay, this girl has superpowers. But when she starts talking fairy princess stuff, they're like, okay, this girl's off the reservation. Like, she's too far gone and she's a nut and she's a weirdo and we don't like her. And it's a fairly common comics trope. I mean, Spider-Man has that sort of outcast, picked on thing. In terms of writing it as a girl character, an interesting thing that really helped me sort of zero in on something was the Hunger Games, the first Hunger Games book. Because the thing I took away from that was that it was a character that was incredibly capable, could do everything that needed to be done in the course of this book. But at least in my reading of it, kind of was doubting her abilities to do these things. And I found that dichotomy interesting, because typically a male character is entirely confident, just like, I got this, whatever. And to see the character sort of questioning while succeeding was an interesting sort of, and it's in other books too. Suddenly Anne of Green Gables, like, that's a character that's just like fully capable, but has these moments, these emotional moments of questioning and doubt and that sort of thing. So I kind of, and to be quite honest, I do the same thing. Like, I'm not so special that I don't have these moments where I go, I don't know that I can draw this. Like, I've written this scene for me and I don't know that I can do it. So it's writing a girl character, but it's just writing a human character that is dealing with the things that people deal with. And if people don't deal with it, they might be lying to themselves.
I really like that answer. And I like that answer, and that you get to the point where you're like, well, actually, it's not gendered. That can happen to any of us humans. Yeah, that was fantastic. Okay, so now I've touched a little bit on each of your individual styles. I'm going to ask you a question, artist to artist. I am an old school artist, and so I work paper, pen, colored pencil. I am clueless when it comes to doing stuff on a computer. And yet I was listening to Sarah talking about, having to repeat images and things like that. And it occurred to me, like, it must help a lot to have certain images that you can sort of like import and then adapt in a computer. So maybe, Sarah, I want to hear from each of you. What are some of your favorite materials? What are things that you enjoy working with? And we'll go in the same order. So Sarah.
Sure. Yeah, I like both. I did Let's Make Ramen is entirely watercolor paintings. And but Let's Make Dumplings I did entirely digitally. Yeah. I
happen to
a
have
box full of the original pages. And there's something very satisfying to have like that physical proof of all of the hours of work that I did. But I did Let's Make Dumplings digitally. I did it drew that in Procreate on the iPad. And it was smooth and fast. It was a lot faster than like IRL materials. But, you also don't have this stack of originals that, that feels very satisfying. I like both, honestly. And when I was doing Let's Make Ramen and I was doing it, all with physical materials, I did use a light table a lot, because not so much for, for the food materials, although in a lot of cases, like certain technical equipment that we were drawing that I didn't know how to draw, like I would practice tracing it, just so I could get all the parts right, just so I could communicate that accurately. But for me and my co-author, like I'm used to drawing myself, very easily. I drew myself so many times for my webcomic. But my co-author, I was not used to drawing. And so there were a lot of times towards the beginning of that project where I was tracing his face over and over and over again, just to get used to how I was going to draw Hugh consistently throughout the story. But yeah, no, I like,
fascinating.
yeah.
No, go
And,
on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's okay. And like, one of the nice thing that the advantages of drawing digitally in Procreate is that you can set up a reference, on the screen as you're working that shows you the photo reference right in front of your face. And you can, paste in your image reference and put it on a lower layer so that you know what you're drawing. Like there's advantages to both, and I really love working with watercolor and gouache on actual paper with an actual brush, but I also love the convenience of working digitally too.
Excellent. And I hope any practitioner out there listening is taking notes, because I am. So Rowan, yeah, I'm very interested to know what mediums you like, what processes you enjoy, what programs, etc.
My process is nonsense. It's nonsense because I also like I like a combo. Like I personally really love pen and ink, nib, inking and drawing. Like old kind of old school, have a little quill, like a little ink pot, nibs. Love that. However, I work professionally, and professional editors have usually have edits, so it tends to be kind of a thing where for personal work I do I do traditional inking, like whenever I have a personal illustration, or like when I'm doing I might want webcomic that's ongoing, and I do that traditionally, just kind of it's almost like it's a break from my other work, so why not do something I find fun with it. And usually for my professional work, for like professional comics, I do it digitally. I do it on Clip Paint Studio. I love that program. I would die for it. But also I use Procreate a lot because the iPad is very convenient. And especially like my webcomic, I tend to do a thing where I sketch it out digitally because that's very convenient to like change and fix things digitally. Then I print it out and I use a little light table to ink over it with a Bristol paper. And so I have this nice Bristol paper that's just the inks and no pencils. And also I get to sell those if I like them. If they're good enough, I can sell them and I get some money. In theory, knock on wood. It's been a while since I've done anything other than that. Like it's been a while since I've done any watercolor. I used to also really like watercolor as well. I've been experimenting with like markers, which has been kind of fun. Like I did a Drawtober last October, which was like basically pen, ink, and markers. But that was fun, and I want to do more experimentation with that.
That is brilliant. Can I ask you to tell me the name of the one you die for again? I wrote down Clip Ink, but I'm sure that's like, how do you spell it?
Clip Studio Paint.
Clip Studio Paint. Okay.
Yes. It is it's a Japanese program, but it's very oriented towards comic making and illustration compared to something like Photoshop.
Cool.
And also you only have to pay one time.
Hey, these are the kind of details that the people out there need to know.
Yes, if you are a digital artist and who's looking for a good program to kind of get you wet your teeth on, Clip Studio Paint's a great one. And wait to get there's this whole thing with Photoshop where it's kind of complicated to say never use Photoshop because a lot of companies require it, and there's often like just a bunch of pipelines involved in it. So I wouldn't say Clip Studio Paint is quite an industry tool, but I love it a lot. I really get a lot out of it.
All right, thank you so much. And Gregg, we want to hear about your process as well.
Well, I'm gonna second Clip Studio Paint. It's what I use. It's great. It has the functions of Photoshop. The one thing it doesn't have, I'll start with the negative, is it only works in RGB. And
yep, the CMYK.
Nope. If you work in print, you got to work in CMYK. So these are coloring processes for anybody watching that doesn't know what all those letters are meaning. So typically I'll draw something in Clip Studio Paint, save it as a PSD, and then open it in Photoshop, convert it to CMYK, and do all my coloring in Photoshop. But Clip Studio Paint is excellent, and it's incredibly cheap. It goes on sale twice a year, and it's like $30.
Yep.
And it's
one-time pay.
One-time pay. You can use it on 2 machines. And I doubled down and got there's a set of brushes at, I think it's friendin.com. You buy the 1 pack of brushes for like $18, and every update you get the update, and there's hundreds of brushes, and brush pens and dry brushes, and it's the wealth of material for such a low entry is unbelievable. And Clip Studio Paint has two tools that I use a lot. One is a perspective ruler that you can set up to 1, 2, or 3 point perspectives, and all your lines hit those marks every time. And then what was the other tool? I mean, that's the big one. There's something else and I just blanked on it, but the perspective thing is really aces. And then just in terms of working digitally, there are things you can do that just become very, very efficient. So I have panel borders ruled out and I just move those into the next file. So I don't have to keep ruling out panel borders, and I have my gutters all set up. You can work in layers very efficiently. I used to, when I was working analog, I also used a light box, and you'd tape the page behind and you'd work on Bristol and it'd be a nice clean thing. But in as much as staring at a screen hurts your eyes, once you have a light box staring through multiple layers of paper, and I would kill the lights in the room so the light box was brighter. You're staring into light all day. So I've been working digitally since 2012, and I really have sort of taken to it to now when I draw analog, my hand goes to the top right if I've drawn a straight line, because I want that history palette. I want to step back a few, and I can't. And it's like, oh wait, I'm on paper. I can't just circle a thing and move a head around or resize it. I have to get it right the first time. So there's a bit of relearning every time.
I'm sorry, but that reminds me, I've had like gone to people's houses where they have toddlers who have iPads, and you give them a book and they're just like,
Yeah. By the same token, for the first probably 2 years I worked digitally, I would erase with the back of the stylus and then wipe the screen.
wipe the
Just
crumbs.
because like you're so accustomed to wiping the eraser shavings. And when I'm not working digitally, I actually love drawing with ballpoint pen. There's something that you can apply a certain amount of pressure and get a very light line, and then you can really sort of dig in and get sort of a thicker, chunkier line, and you can really, at least I can really draw some very sort of cool looking artwork, and you still sort of see the construction underneath. I get a little obsessed with figure construction and just general construction of drawings. And when you draw on ballpoint pen, it's all kind of there, and it has a very unique, it almost looks like it's penciled, but it's got a permanence to it that I do like. If I'm just sketching and doodling, it's usually ballpoint pen.
So isn't this fun, you guys? Like, this is such a pleasure to just kind of dig into it and hear about everybody's like true details here. This is fantastic. So now I'm going to think from a young person's perspective who might be listening and might be considering this and saying, maybe it's possible for me. I'd like your pros and cons about the training that you did. You do not have to name the institution if you choose not to. But you can share what were some, like, pick something that was awesome about your training and something you could have done without in your training. Same order. So Sarah, Rowan, and Gregg.
I feel like this is a tricky one. And I'm betraying my age here, but when I was in college and I decided that I wanted to do comics, I think I was a sophomore in college, and a friend gave me Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and I was like, this is what comics can be. This is what this medium can do, and I want to be a part of it. And I went to my professors, and they were like, we don't know what to do with you. Like, nobody at that time, I went to college in the late 90s. Nobody at that time had a comics program. Nobody at that time had any kind of sequential art program at all. Because I wasn't in like a traditional art school, and I was just at like a regular college doing an art major, I think my professors were a little more open to the idea of independent study. And so they were like, tell us what that would mean, what that's going to look like for you. And then I just ended up going off on my own and finding all of the comics and comics artists that I wanted to read and that I wanted to be influenced by, and drawing my own comics from there. So in that sense, I don't know, like, it was limiting, but also, freeing at the same time. It was a little bit Wild Westy, because there wasn't a structure, there wasn't a manual, there wasn't any kind of, road guide, but I was allowed to, sort of make my own map, as I was figuring it out.
You're
I
preaching
think
to
it's
the
a lot.
choir with me, because that's how I taught middle school. And it drove some
Yeah.
kids crazy. Some kids were like, will you just like lead me through it? And I'd be like, no, it's wide open. What are you into? And let's just make it
Right.
happen. And a
Well,
lot
and
of
if
weird,
you're,
wonderful things happen.
yeah, and if you're passionate enough about it, right, you're always
Yeah.
going to have that initiative, and you're going to have that drive. You're going to be very proactive in seeking out the materials, and driving yourself to to always be more and be better, and learn as much as you can. Yeah, I don't know, like I think it's a lot easier now for kids because there's so many schools that actually have comic art or sequential art programs. And a lot of the people that I sort of came into adulthood drawing comics with and going to comic book conventions with are now teaching at those programs, which is really cool to see. I mean, it's amazing to see the field gain a lot more legitimacy. But I think it's very different. I don't know. There's pros and cons to both sides. To me, being able to create basically my own program, and to kids these days having so much more guidance and so many more resources to learn this stuff.
Very cool. Thank you. And I'm older than you, so don't feel bad. Rowan, how about you? Your training. When you think about young people coming up, what's worth seeking out and what wasn't so great? Like,
Okay, real quick, up front, you don't have to go to art college if you feel like you can't afford it. It's okay. It's all right. Like, I got a lot out of art college because I'm that kind of learner. But the internet's a wild, beautiful place, and you can really get a lot from learning there, or like getting mentorships or online classes. Art school's very expensive, and I've had friends who really, really didn't have great times. At RISD, because I already mentioned it, so why not? I got a lot because I got a little. It's hard to say like how like the cons of it, because it's all the choices I made there and choices made for me ultimately cultivated who I am today, to the point where I find it hard to comprehend what I could be without this experience, including the bad. But like at art school, I got lots of many friends. I've literally had the same friend group I have from college. I love them. I also got so many influences, and I learned so much, and that's how I really got into digital inking. And I feel like that really was a great, incredible thing that really became a cornerstone in my art and how I think about art. However, RISD in particular is technically a design school, but a lot of the classes are more theoretical based. Like as you kind of said before, we technically had comic classes, but a lot of the illustration especially was based around more terms editorial, and sort of like old fashioned editorial of like you had like 2 days to draw like an illustration for this newspaper, that kind of thing, and did not really consider there's like a huge age gap where there was like the teachers either like 60s and retired from like editorial or book illustration, or they were like in their 30s and they're taking a break from like comic game development and to do a couple classes in RISD. It's that kind of vibe. And so college is very much what you make it. And like, I think that's like really going into college and that kind of mindset helps. And also the idea of like, you don't have to.
I love it. No, and you sound very grounded in that you accept the totality of your experience as making you who you are today, which is a very, very Zen, gorgeous way to look at it. So kudos
the power
to
of
you.
hindsight. The power of hindsight. Like I had to take so many dumb classes for RISD.
Yeah, I think anyone who goes to any sort of anything in terms of school has to take some things they don't want to take. So thank you very much. And Gregg, what would you say to a young person who's thinking about a career in this based on your own personal training?
I'd say first, I'm an old person, so my training is so old that it doesn't, there's almost no connection to what young people can do now. So YouTube didn't exist. Email was brand new when I was finishing college. So the scope of what is possible now to what Rowan said, is like, you can, I mean, I learned all the stuff I learned without the internet. So what you can learn now with the internet is bananas. You know, I do YouTube videos. A lot of people do YouTube videos showing you, here's how I draw, here's how I compose this, here's how I do that. I never had a comic book creator come to my school and do a 1-hour talk of how they make comics. I've done that at schools. Like the scope of what younger people are exposed to in terms of how this career exists, because I've always equated this career, at least my version of it, to not so different than a musician or an actor or a comedian. It's this job that has no traditional structures to it. So you kind of learn from the people who did it before you and start learning the lingo and start learning the craft and the trade more than you can learn it at school. Now you can, I guess, learn it at school. I don't know what they're teaching in school, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. I have no idea. To part of your question was what's a highlight of something you learned, right? For me, it was after I left art school. So as an art school dropout, I was back in South Florida where I grew up, and I had read in the newspaper that Will Eisner was teaching his 8-week workshop about an hour away from where I lived. And I did that. And that 8 weeks of going there once a week and bringing your 2 or 3 pages in and having him look at them and critique your pages and really break down storytelling, because his focus wasn't necessarily on beautiful drawings. It was, can you tell a story with pictures? That's the goal. That's the goal of making comics, is to tell this story so that a person can look at it and without even reading a single word, follow what's going on. And that sort of fundamental craft of sequential art, comic storytelling. If this is what you want to do, that's what I would say. That's like the fundamentals, right? Like, we work digitally, but to me, working digitally is like using a calculator. If you don't know how math works, the calculator doesn't really help you know how to do math. So if you can't draw, a tablet is not going to make you better at drawing. If you can't tell a story, Clip Studio Paint isn't going to teach you how to tell a story. So to me, it's the bare bones fundamentals of drawing and telling a story that are the most important thing. And whether you learn that at school or from the internet or from people like us, to take that information in and learn it.
I think that's fantastic. And it speaks to the fundamentals don't change for millennia. Like, we humans crave story. The archetypes speak to our souls. We like delight and surprise and mystery and a little bit of gross stuff thrown in there, you know, like what she found down in that tube when she shrank was pretty gross. Anyway, but yeah, you're speaking to the fundamentals, and I really like that. Gosh, there's so much more we could talk about. I want to make sure that we open it up for questions as well, but I think I'm going to ask one more question before we do that. Oh my God, I have so many choices. Oh, because you referenced mouse, I want to know what stands out to you as one of the most memorable visually told narratives. And it could be comic book form, but it could also be other art forms. Like, it could be film or animation or whatever. Like, is there a story with the visuals that has just swept you away? So pick something and tell us what it is, and maybe I'll add it to my library list at the Westport Library. I need to see this or read this or watch this. But yeah, something that really, like, you still think about.
Oh, this is a really tough one because there are so many to choose from. But I think for me, I always come back to Linda Berry. And and I feel like and this doesn't really, I mean, I love her work. I pretty much love everything that she's done. And this isn't quite comics, but her book Cruddy, which is a story about a middle schooler, and just it's a very difficult story. A lot of difficult things happen. It's not comics. It's not her typical comic book style, but it's like sporadically illustrated throughout the book. And the illustrations add so much pathos to what's already like a heavily emotional story. And I've gone back and reread it so many times, and it's just like, I don't know, it's just like you soak in it. It's such a powerfully told story. I mean, I love everything that she does, but that's the one that like left me, curled up on the sofa in tears.
Her stuff gets me every time. Like it's just
Yeah.
a punch to the solar plexus of middle school me. Like you see me too well. She's
But I feel like even her like her instructional stuff that's come out of her teaching at UW-Madison, because I've been reading through some of like the syllabus and other books that she's done about her class. Even the coursework feels like you get me, you understand me, like the philosophy of how we all used to draw no problem as children. Like there was no filter there. We never sat down and said, I can't draw. We sat down and we played with crayons and drew, from a very spontaneous primal point in all of us. And somewhere along the lines, as you grow up, you lose that. And
well,
even
you
something
get
like
socialized, darling. You get socialized.
Even that technical stuff, like she gets so like emotional and psychological with.
Well, thank you for bringing her back to my mind because she's amazing. How about you, Rowan?
Also a difficult question for me because there is, even beyond just books, there's also like, especially growing up with the internet, there's like so many like web comics or like web serials or just like international comics that I would not get otherwise that I really love, like manga. But like it was something that like I always come to mind, like especially as a big influence in my work, is the work of Emily Carroll. She is a horror, but it's her book. She had like one comic in particular called His Face is Red that went around the internet a while ago. I really recommend looking up her work. It's a great use of digital space, like the digital space and scrolling, but also her book, Through the Woods, I really, really enjoyed. And it's really a great example of what kind of horror you can do in comics. Even beyond, say, the kind of stock B-movie horror. It's very fairy tale and very creepy, interesting, but really beautiful and colorful. Really big influence on my work.
I am just adding to my reading list. This is so epic.
I second that. Emily Carroll is magnificent. Yeah. Absolutely beautiful.
Very cool. And Gregg, your turn.
So this is definitely the toughest question because I mean, like I was like looking at my shelf. I'm like, what's on the shelf? What can I? And I'm looking at like the things on my wall, and like all of these things can count. Every one of these things can be an answer to this question. But I was looking at my shelf. The thing that struck me is it's not a comic. It's a middle grade novel by Jules Pfeiffer. So Jules Pfeiffer in general is just like a titan. And he did these middle grade books. One is called The Man in the Ceiling. The other one is called A Barrow of Laughs, A Veil of Tears. And they are books where the illustrations and the text are linked in the way comics link words and pictures. And the illustrations are helping tell the story, and they're funny and clever and charming. And when I read those in my early 20s, it definitely flipped a switch in my brain and sort of made me rethink the way words and pictures sort of work together, to the point where now I do these books. I'm going to do a plug thing. It's these animal superhero books called Superhero Universe, but they are a combination of text and illustration with comic sequences somewhere in there. Anyway, there's comics there. There's comics in there as well. So that kind of seeing it done by somebody like Jules Pfeiffer, who is like an aspirational figure in the amount of things he's done. He's a playwright, he's a screenwriter, he's everything. And he's still working. He's in his 90s and he's still making graphic novels. Yeah. So that kind of a thing to me was a game changer in terms of understanding what words and pictures can do and how far you can go with it. And then for a young audience, for an older audience, all that sort of thing. So I give my points. I put all my chips in Jules Pfeiffer.
I grew up, my parents had a subscription to the Village Voice when I was a kid, which was salacious at best, but Jules Pfeiffer had a lot of great stuff in there. So did Linda Berry, actually. She was in Village Voice. I also, I think of Neil Gaiman's, what is it, the whole epic Sandman thing with different artists. Yeah, that one's, and Brian Selznick's books, gosh, all of Brian Selznick's stuff blows me away. So yeah, well, let's open it up to the audience. I want to thank you. I've had I've had this like a party for me. Like I've just had the best time, and I wish that I had snacks to offer all of you so we could just keep talking. But I want to thank you because this has been absolutely delightful, and I'll pass it over to Jennifer, who's going to have questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. This was fantastic. And I have had so much fun just listening in. So I'm sure our audience is the same. We do have some questions from the audience. And again, if anyone watching has a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A tab. Number one, and I'm going to go in the opposite order that you all have been answering. So Gregg is going to go first this time. So listen up. So if there's an artist out there who wants to get into the publishing world, what advice do you give that person?
Yeesh, that's a very big and difficult question. I mean, there's a lot of questions that have to get asked in response, like what kind of art do you want to do? What kind of books do you want to illustrate? That, you know, and each one of those things could be a different path, and each one of those paths could be splintered off. So like right now, the stuff I do in terms of book publishing, I'm doing on my own. I'm self-publishing through Amazon's publishing platform. But other paths are put your work together and get an art rep, or find an agent who can represent you and put you in the place to get these kinds of jobs. Web comics is a way that you can just, again, blaze your own trail. It really depends on how much of a self-starter you want to be and how much effort you want to put into doing it. It's every path is going to take effort. It doesn't just happen. But there's so many different paths that I don't know that I could sit here and say, well, here's what you got to do, because I've tried a lot of different paths, and some of them have worked and some of them haven't, and some of them still trying. So I can't say that I'm in the, I can't say with any authority, this is what I would do. I guess if I were starting now, I'd probably have a webcomic. That would be my focus is building some sort of web presence. I don't know how to play the algorithms of that and how to get noticed on Instagram, but I know that that is what I would be doing, as opposed to what I did in the 90s, which was draw 5-page samples, photocopy them, and send them in the mail. So I'd be sending links over email.
Mm. And Rowan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I have gotten all my jobs through Twitter, unfortunately enough.
Through Twitter?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
A webcomic, I
Tell me I'm wrong, by all means.
no. It's the opposite. I'm trying to, like, I have done all my work through, mostly because you were talking about the algorithm, and I'm like, I have just done the work I've always wanted to do, and it's just put it out there, and I've gotten a reaction based off that. Like I do a webcomic, and it's very niche. It's like it's a mystery occult webcomic set in the 1920s, and because I love doing this, that's a story I want to write, but I had multiple editors coming up to me and said, like, hey, I've read that your webcomic, do you want to do something kind of like your webcomic? It's like, sure. But there is this emphasis on, and I think I feel like you could really, really get into things like branding and algorithms, and especially when it comes to Instagram. Instagram's really made around that kind of things, but I find that exhausting, so I don't. And I just kind of draw what makes me happy, and usually that kind of comes across.
Okay. Great. And Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, what they've already said is basically how I ended up with my career. Is I had a webcomic and put it on Twitter and put it on Instagram, and that got me noticed for my first paying jobs, which sort of launched me into my first publishing jobs. One thing that I would add is that, you know, if you are looking to move from self-publishing and doing webcomics to the publishing world, this is going to sound horrible, but one of the most important things that I've learned is that talent is nowhere near as important as meeting deadlines and being pleasant to work with. And the editors and publishers that I've worked with, will happily fire people who are much better artists than I am, but who can't meet a deadline, and hire somebody who's maybe they're arts, maybe they're not the most talented artist in the world, but they're reliable and they're nice to work with. So that would be my most practical advice.
That's a good piece, actually. I think people need to hear that. I mean, that wouldn't necessarily cross my mind, but deadlines make sense.
Yeah.
So now you all have mentioned your online comics and your websites, but you haven't actually given us the names, or how do we find you all online? Because I know everybody's now going to log off of this and go hunt you down. So Rowan, what's the easiest or way to find you and your art?
The nice thing about having a name like mine is if you just type it in, you'll usually find it. But I have like my username that I use for all my social media is Skulking Foxes.
Skulking Foxes. Excellent.
Yes. Like a skulk of foxes. It was a group name of the fox. That's where it came from. You should be able to find all my stuff through there.
Cool.
Yep.
And Gregg?
My stuff is all at my full name, which is not easy to spell. So I'll give it to you. It's Greggg. There's 2 G's on the end of Gregg, and the last name is Schigiel, and that's greggschiegel.com, and that's what I am on Twitter and Instagram.
Great. And Sarah?
Yeah, I go by my name on Twitter and Instagram too. My website is sarahbecan.com, SARAHBECAN. And I feel bad because I've mentioned my webcomic several times in this talk, and I actually took it down a few weeks ago.
Oh no.
Because I was having trouble with WordPress and updating the comics theme that I was running on it. I've been meaning to start it up again. You know, most of those comics are 10 years old anyway. But if you search Sawsome, you might be able to find some of them on Pinterest and other places.
Okay. Well, let us know when you're back up and running, and we'll send people over.
Instead of a newsletter.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And I'm just going to ask one more question, which is, do you have any projects in the works that you can tell us about right now, so we can keep our eyes peeled for them?
Too many.
Now I have to tell. We'll go with Gregg first.
So I'm all about these books I'm doing that I have right in front of me. The superhero universe. They're animal superhero stories for kids like 7 to 10 years old. They combine prose and comics. Third book is coming out imminently. I'm just waiting for Amazon to approve the paperback. But those are, you get them on Amazon. If you search superhero universe, it's the only thing that comes up. So that's
Cool.
I put all my energy towards that right now.
Okay. And Rowan?
Again, too many. There's a couple things that had not been announced, so I don't think I'd say yet. But I'm working on the next book in my webcomic because that's a personal project, and so that's going to coming up soon. Basically, I'm going to start updating either the end of this month or the start next. I am doing a short comic for this online convention called Shortbox, where basically I get to debut, where basically a bunch of artists get to debut a new short comic just for that basically event. And so that's coming up. And I'm also pitching some things, so that's gonna be fun.
Great. Well, we're all looking forward to it, and we all wish you the best of luck. And
Wait, did Sarah
let me know.
get to plug something?
Did Sarah?
Oh,
and
sorry.
I'll plug something at the end too of my own.
Sorry.
I got so carried away. Sorry, Sarah.
Okay, there's one thing. It's going to be a really long time before it's out, but I am just starting a new comic book cookbook with Ken Forkish on sourdough recipes.
Ooh, topical.
Yeah. Right?
Topical. We've all been making a
Everybody
lot of
was baking bread. Right?
Well, based on Let's Make Ramen and Let's Make Dumplings, I think I'll be there looking at it.
Thank you.
Those drawings were fabulous. Now, Kirsten, what are you working on next?
I have a website. It's cupofcards.com, and I sell greeting cards, note paper, stickers, and the line is going to increase and expand. I just did a bouquet of sunflowers with the Ukrainian people in mind, and a portion is going to go to Save the Children. Anyway, so if you want to see my stuff, it's at www.cupofcards.com.
Terrific. Well, on behalf of the Westport Library, I'm going to thank you all for a fantastic hour of education and art. And I'm so glad that you could all make it here. And Greg, yes, we have noticed time shifting in your window behind you. So that's been
I
a
fade to-
fabulous.
yes, as I fade to black.
Great. Well, before that actually happens, I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you all for watching at home, and keep watching westportlibrary.org for more fun programming. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.